The First World War, also called the Great War, or the War to End All Wars, was a conflict the likes of which the world has never before experienced. This global conflict, the first of its kind, featured deadly battles like the Battle of Kolubara, the Battle of the Somme, and the Gallipoli campaign, all of which are still famous and talked about to this very day. In this video, however, we are going to take a look at one of the less famous battles of the First World War, the Battle of Osowiec Fortress, also known as the Attack of the Dead Men. The Battle of Osowiec Fortress was one of the most interesting battles of the First World War. After all, it sounds like quite a supernatural folktale. The difference being, this attack of the living dead actually happened. The battle took place in eastern Poland during the First World War. In 1915, the Central Powers launched a full-front offensive into the Russian Empire. The ill-equipped Russian army could not withstand the superior firepower of the Germans, leading to the full frontal collapse. The Russians ordered a general retreat to save what soldiers and equipment they could. For this task to be achieved, certain units were ordered to hold the line until the last man to ensure the safe retreat of their comrades. One of these units was the 226th Infantry Regiment, tasked to hold the Osowiec fortress with the help of some locally recruited militiamen against the oncoming German offensive. The battle took place on the 6th of August 1915, though this wasn't the first time the Germans tried breaking the fortress. They had first tried assaulting it in September of 1914, heavily bombarding it for days before launching an attack, almost sure of victory. However, to their astonishment, the Russian defenders managed to force them back. Another attack was attempted in February of 1915, this time with even greater artillery fire and air bombardments from the German side. The result, however, was largely the same. Osowiec held for months. So, why was the fortress so hard to take? Humans build fortresses ever since we first settled and began waging wars on one another. What they essentially are force multipliers. A fortified position allows a smaller number of defenders to hold against a much larger number of attackers, making fortresses the perfect defense weapons. And the First World War was no different. The military doctrine of the time encouraged the construction of heavily armored, impenetrable fortresses designed to, with adequate supply, potentially hold off attackers forever. Osowiec was one of these fortresses. The third time the Germans attacked, they were commanded by Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, and this time they had an ace up their sleeve. Hindenburg waited for the wind to turn towards the Russian positions and then ordered a chlorine gas attack. The nations of the world have experimented with chemical warfare for decades up to the First World War, but those weapons have been nothing more than irritants. The Germans were the ones to spearhead chemical weapon development during the Great War, but they would not be the only ones. In January 1915, the Germans fired shells loaded with xylyl bromide on the Russian troops on the eastern fronts. January was a cold month, so most of the gas froze instead of dispersing, though the Russians still reported over 1,000 casualties as a result of this deadly weapon. Chlorine gas was first used on the Western Front against British troops in the Second Battle of Ypres. Even the Germans themselves referred to chlorine gas as a terrible weapon, though that wouldn't mean they would stop using it against the enemy. Now that we have discussed the circumstances of the battle, let us discuss the statistics. The Germans had 14 battalions consisting of around 7,000 to 8,000 men, along with 30 heavy siege guns and 30 artillery poison gas batteries. The Russian defenses, meanwhile, were manned by 500 men of the 226th Infantry Regiment with the help of around 400 locally recruited militia. The Russians were issued only rudimentary gas masks, which were basically useless against the oncoming attack, and the Germans knew this. On the 6th of August, the wind was favorable and Hindenburg ordered the gas attack as well as intense shelling of the fortress. Russian accounts of the event state the cloud of poison was green and yellow as it floated menacingly towards them. It turned the grass black and dropped birds and butterflies out of the sky. You can imagine what it did to human lungs. See, chlorine is a highly soluble vapor, meaning it easily reacts with water. It is a very effective weapon if you consider the fact that humans are made up of around 60% water. The gas causes chemical burns, severe eye irritation, difficulty breathing, vomiting, and even death in higher doses. One could safely say those affected by chlorine gas looked more dead than alive. Now you see where the battle gets its name from. Once the gas had cleared, 12 German Landwehr battalions moved in to take the fortress, expecting little to no resistance. You can imagine how shocked the German soldiers were when the remaining Russians charged at them with all they had left. Their skin was falling from their faces, their eyes red, coughing up blood and pieces of their own lungs. That undead horde of face-melting zombie-like Russians charged through and slammed into an army of 7,000. The Germans panicked and retreated at the sight of the undead Russians. During the frantic retreats, many of them fell into their own barbed wire traps as they trampled over each other. An unidentified survivor later recounted, I can't describe the anger and fury that gripped our soldiers as they headed towards their poisoners, the Germans. Heavy rifles, machine guns, heavy shrapnel could not stop the onslaught of frenzied soldiers. The undead Russians opened fire on the retreating Germans, inflicting heavy casualties and winning the day by stopping their advance. The Germans may not have realized it then, but their 7,000 troops were pushed back by a mere 60 to 100 survivors who landed themselves a place in history. Even though the Russians emerged victorious at Osowiec for the third time, they realized they could no longer hold the fortress. After all, it had achieved its purpose. The fortress held for long enough so that the rest of the army could safely retreat. So the Russians dismantled and destroyed it 2 weeks later on August 22nd before retreating with the rest of the army. The battle would later be called the Attack of the Dead Men.